So what I'm going to do is a quick counter through of the implications for the built environment from the Rio Earth Summit back in 1992 through to Glasgow COP26 today, or not quite today, next month. So that's me, but you've heard about me, we'll skittle on. The Stockholm conference actually predates Rio right back to 1972, so almost 50 years ago. It was the formal title, the UN Conference on the Human Environment. And what it did was, one of the things it did relevant to the built environment was to set about establishing a international financial institution whose primary objective will be to strengthen national programs around human settlements and housing. And that was really the first international coming together, recognising the importance of housing in the environment. Following on from that, it was the Vancouver Habitat Conference in '76, which led a couple of years later to the establishment of the UN Habitat Organisation. And again, referencing the importance of housing and settlements, and also noting the positive transformative force for people and communities, reducing issues about inequality, discrimination, and poverty. And that's really key to that link between housing and those other social issues. And you see that coming through then on our next timeline of the Our Common Future report in 1987, otherwise known as the Brundtland Report, where a definition of sustainable development was set out, which we still embrace today. That idea about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is generally regarded as laying the groundwork for the Rio Earth Summit in '92, but also importantly for the Sustainable Development Goals that didn't come in until much later. And I'll come back to that. So here we are at the Rio Earth Summit in '92. There were, I think, 27 principles that were agreed at the Rio Earth Summit, and 3 of them have particular relevance to the built environment. Number 3 was the right that development must be fulfilled equitably across current and future generations. So picking up that point from the Sustainable Development definition. Principle number 4 was about environmental protection shall constitute an integral part of the development process and cannot be considered in isolation. So that's sort of picking up the point about the 3 pillars of sustainability we talk about environmental, economic, and financial sustainability, and about the interlinkedness of those 3 things. And finally, point number 8, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and promote appropriate demographic policies. And that was when we started to set the agenda for how national regulations and industry patterns should start to change to embrace more sustainable practice. Now, the first COP was actually in Berlin in 1995, and that was set up to review the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was established by the Rio Conference. However, this set the cycle for the ups and downs of the COP process. And the closing line there said that the first conference of the parties could not convince all delegates and observers that the first conference of the party was an unqualified success. But 5 years later, there was a lot more success and a lot more positive intent around the world with the Kyoto Protocol from COP3. And at that same time, there were lots of other events in different cities around the world, one of which was in Newcastle, Australia, where I lived at the time, where the Pathways to Sustainability Conference was convened and had a fantastic host of speakers: David Suzuki, Vandana Shiva, Antrane Rilava, the Rocky Mountains Institute, all of whom are still active in this field today. There were two key things to come out of that. One was to accelerate uptake on Agenda 21 from Rio, but also to recognise the importance of local governments and communities in doing that. And that's been recognised just recently, where we're seeing a lot of national governments dragging the chain on this, whereas cities and regional councils have been much more proactive. And we can see that even in the UK with a number of councils declaring a climate emergency. Copenhagen, COP15 in 2009 was probably the next most notable one, and there was a lot of hope put into Copenhagen only to be dashed. As this quote says, there was no agreement on how to do this in practical terms. So we got that commitment to the 2 degrees Celsius limit on temperature rise, but no global agreement on how to do it. There were high points around the time. In the UK, we had the Code for Sustainable Homes. And indeed, in 2009, the government set a target for net zero homes by 2016, only for that target to be scrapped a few years later. And we are still far short of that target in terms of UK regulations now. Then to Paris, which was a success, hands in the air. Everybody thought this was good. And the World Green Building Council put out that particular message, recognising the importance of construction and real estate in delivering on the ambitions of Paris. And you can see why. Construction responsible for 36% of emissions, 40% of energy, 50% of raw materials. Construction has the biggest impact of any sector in terms of carbon and sustainability. So what are we going to get from Glasgow? It's got 4 stated ambitions: secure net zero by mid-century, adapt to protect communities and habitats, mobilise finance and work together. And you can see that the built environment is, of course, integral to all those. And then it has some very specific targets for the built environment about the things that we need to do as an industry to implement that, and how the industry is going to pivot. So on that note, just quickly, I'll skate through what the industry is doing. So we've got, for one, the Construction Leadership Council and their Construct Zero strategy. And that was a direct response to the UK government 6 carbon budget. It established 9 priority areas, and you can see they cover actually a whole range of things, not just how you build a building. It's to do with transport. It's about how energy use during the construction process. It's about monitoring and recording of actions. So there's a really broad range of activities included in that. You've got informal structures like Built Environment Declares, which came out of the original Architects Declare movement, and another group called ACAN, Architects Climate Action Network, which is really proactive in promoting this amongst built environment professionals. You've got organisations like the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and their 2030 Climate Challenge. Very comprehensive document, very clear targets set out in stages through to 2030. Unfortunately, this has been watered down just in the last year or so. It's got no formal status, but it was a really good marker to have out there in the industry. Lots of established industry schemes like BREEAM and LEED or Passive House, all of which have international recognition at different levels. But you're also getting this in finance. So one of the really interesting ones is the World Bank Group have something they call the EDGE guidelines, which have sustainability rankings. And these are increasingly being linked to funding for development in less developed countries, particularly. In Europe, there's another one called Active House, which is quite frequently referenced, which does similar things. You've got all the different certification schemes. FSC for timber was probably the most recognised, but there are other for registering chemical and toxicity materials, Cradle to Cradle, which is about circular economy, and industry-specific ones like textiles. And just as a plug for a couple of local industries about manufacturing, bringing mainstream low-carbon products to the market. Kenotech is a spin-out from Heriot Watt University, and they have unfired clay bricks made from recycled waste aggregates. Or Indie Nature, which is making hemp fibre insulation, setting up a factory down here in the Scottish borders. Both of those products have only about 10% of the embodied carbon of the standard market products they will be taking the place of. And that is key. So what are the challenges? I put them under 3 headings. 1 is reducing carbon emissions, 2 is the circular economy, and 3 is the idea of social and natural capital. So if we look at those quickly, firstly, reducing carbon, it's about energy efficiency. Fabric first to make the building as energy efficient as possible, and then the use of appropriate technology, whether that's drawing through the grid or on site. This is now well embedded. The regulations do not have us at net zero standard. They don't have us where we need to be, but most developed countries have this in place and have had for a long time. So those are the examples of the California regulations from 2013, and they go back further than that. What isn't yet embedded is embodied carbon. And so as an example of that, if you look at whole life carbon in a building, something between 30 to 50% is not the energy we use in our gas boilers, it's the embodied carbon from construction. And as the grid decarbonises, the embodied carbon actually becomes 100% of that. But even in just the last 6 months, this has really taken hold of the industry. Colorado has now embedded embodied carbon in their building regulations, and there's talk about the same thing happening here in the UK. Circular economy is a much bigger one. It covers a whole range of positive outcomes to do with natural capital, optimising resource use, designing out waste, those sorts of things. It's an idea that's been around for a good 20 or 30 years. In some manufacturing industries, it's well embedded. It's just been slower to update in the construction industry, but the framework is there to deliver on that. Perhaps less embedded is the idea of social and natural capital. There have been lots of green philosophers who've talked about this again for the last 20 or 30 years, but the implementation has been slow. However, there is increasing talk about maybe not capital, but about values and about how we need to put different values on things that we deliver through sustainable development. And I think that is how it's going to start to have a place in construction, through the idea of value engineering and how we define the value we put on things in the construction industry.